Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in this fine world. And we're here with another edition of the Ice Series, a weekly discussion on ice swimming, cold water swimming, cold water immersion, and all those topics related to the cold. I'm here with my co-host, Ram Barkai, the visionary behind ice swimming and the founder of the International Ice Swimming Association, and two professors, very renowned from Britain, which we'll ask them to introduce themselves. Welcome, Ram.
Good evening and welcome to Mike and Heather.
Yes, and Professor Tipton, would you prefer to be called Mike? Is that okay? Okay.
Yeah, that Mike's great. Thank you.
Yeah, and we'll follow along that line. And Heather, we'll ask you to give us a short introduction of yourself and your interest in cold water immersion, ice swimming, etc. Go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Steve, and thank you for the promotion. So over in the UK, I'd be classed as a doctor rather than a professor, but semantics. So yeah, my name's Heather Massey. I work in the extreme environments laboratory at the University of Portsmouth with Mike, and I have a deep passion for looking at what happens to the body when we go into cold water. I'm also a swimmer as well, and have completed a channel solo and have done a little bit of ice swimming too.
Yeah. And Mike?
Yeah, thank you, Steve, and thanks, Ram. So my name is Mike Tipton. I'm a professor of human and applied physiology at the same group that Heather's in, the Extreme Environments Laboratory at the University of Portsmouth. I started life as a swimmer, albeit an indoor one, then went and played rugby for about 30 years, and then switched to triathlon when rugby got too painful. And that, of course, then worked my way slowly up to Ironman distance, and that includes open water swimming, of course, although not in iced water, thankfully.
Yeah. And before we dive into our main topics of acclimatization, recovery, etc., I wanted to ask both of you, how did you get involved in cold water immersion in the first place? And before this conversation, Mike, you were talking about, you brought us back to World War II. And if you could say a little bit, introduce the topic from that point.
So as part of an MSc I did, and at that time I was very interested in swimming and temperature regulation, although those two worlds were quite different. But when I went to the Institute of Naval Medicine, a surgeon commander there called Frank Golden was doing studies on swim failure in cold water. And it was a sort of collision of two worlds which had previously been apart. And I was just fascinated by the area. I'd volunteered for the experiment, which was a 20-minute swim in 5-degree water. And I guess because I was a pretty competent swimmer, I got through it. And then Frank and I formed a lifelong working relationship, really, until he passed on in 2004. The reason the Navy were interested in this area was because during the Second World War, there were 45,000 deaths of Royal Navy personnel. 30,000 of them, so 2/3 of them, died during the survival phase. So not as a result of a direct result of enemy action, but because they were dying in life rafts and in the water following enemy action. And that obviously was a big issue for the Royal Navy. So they started investigating cold water immersion and its effects.
Got it. And Heather, what was your impetus to start?
I come from a background of swim teaching and competitive swimming as well in the pool. And it's really that that knowledge and education of wanting to inform people about the potential dangers of being in water, but also the potential means that we can keep ourselves safe that really sort of drives me. And that's why one of the reasons I joined Mike's team.
Got it. Now, Mike was 20 minutes in 5-degree water. What was your first experience in the cold water?
Well, I've entered one of the world championships that was in Berghausen, and I think the water was 1 degree, and I lasted about 17 minutes. So, yeah, I'm still feeling the effects of that water temperature though, even today.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. And Ram, how did you get involved with Mike and Heather?
Well, Mike is very humble, but he is very well known in the area. So anyone who does a bit of reading and interest in extreme cold or heat come across Mike. I think Mike, we met first time in South Africa. He was talking in a conference, and I, with no degree, I was just talking about experience, and we met and we chatted, which was quite interesting. That was a while ago, and actually a lot of things changed since. The sort of the ice swimming was still a very young med sport. Now it's slightly less young, still med sport. I know Heather from ice swimming. Heather is actually sits on the ISA. We have few doctors that sits on our medical forum when we debate issues regarding ice swimming, and Heather is one of them. I think Ruth Williams is another one, and Dr. Sean from South Africa is the other one. Heather, what are you still feeling from WOWSA? It was so long ago.
Yeah, it was 4 years ago, but since then I've had quite a numbness in both my middle fingers, but at the tips of my middle fingers. It's possibly related to either a non-freezing cold injury or developing Raynaud's. So yeah, even though it's 4 years ago, I'm still feeling the effects of that cold swim.
Wow. Okay. Now, one of the things that I know Ram is very interested in, not only personally, but also for the sake of others in the International Ice Swimming Association, is recovery. Now, this is, I've heard that people like Lewis Pugh has had problems with his hands 1, 2, 3 months subsequent to a swim. Heather, this is the first time I've heard of anybody with years. Do you think that you're an outlier, or this may be some uncovered phenomena?
Mike will be able to tell you a little bit more. I think we don't know enough about the sort of the pathophysiology of being in very cold water and what it's going to do to our peripheral vasculature. But yeah, I've had numbness on and off for the last 4 years in those digits. And it's particularly problematic for winter swimming. So I no longer really stay in the water for very long, and so prefer to swim in the summer when it's warmer.
Yeah. Mike, what might be happening with her physiologically?
So people will be very aware of freezing cold injury or frostbite. It's a pretty well-known phenomenon. What's much less well known, but actually more common, is non-freezing cold injury. And the symptoms, long-term symptoms, are numbness in the periphery and pain sometimes. They're sweating in the injured parts, and you become cold sensitive. So when you get into just a cool environment, you very quickly shut down, and you stay shut down for a long while. And it's more a syndrome than, because there's lots of mixtures in terms of how it can come about. It's much more well known in the military. It's much more well known in terms of cold air exposure. And certainly within the military, it's the most common form of non-direct battle related injury. So it's amazing that not many people have heard about it. One of the problems is, we know, despite years of trying to understand it, and we're talking about in the UK, this going right back to the Falklands campaign in 1982, but you can see it going right back centuries, this non-freezing cold injury. We know very little about what the dose of cold is in terms of producing it. So we don't know very much about the pathogenesis. We know not very much about the pathology, but we do know it's a microvascular injury, either to the small nerve fibers in the extremities or to the vasculature, or probably a combination of both, that produces this cold sensitivity, sweating in the injured area, numbness and pain. we know that this can be a lifelong condition. For lots of people, it's mild or it's moderate and it gets better. I suspect that anybody listening to this who has been involved in any kind of outdoor pursuits, walking in cold, wet, walking in cold, swimming, will have a degree of, I mean, I know I have, mine probably would be classed as mild to moderate. It becomes more of a problem when it gets to the severe stage and you're in constant pain and it's changing the way you walk and et cetera, et cetera. It can be lifelong. For a while, when we were running the cold injuries clinic at the Institute of Naval Medicine, where Heather and I both worked before we went to Portsmouth University, we were seeing people who had picked up their cold injury in the Korean War. And we were seeing that right through the 90s and later. So, it's really hard to say. It's a bit like blood pressure. I suspect everybody's got it, but it's only when it gets to a certain level that you start to be concerned about it. And in terms of ice swimming, we have no idea about the exposure required in order to produce an injury that doesn't go away. We've got some idea about how to test for it, but not where you should say stop. But of course, as with everything, people are trying to spend longer and longer and do more immersions a day. And of course, every time you do that, you're creeping closer and closer, I suspect, to the dose of cold required to produce what is a fairly debilitating injury that can end up with amputation.
Yeah. When you mentioned dose, just so I'm clear, that's a combination of, let's say, water temperature, duration in the water, ambient temperature, wind, rewarming.
Yeah. Okay. Absolutely. So if you forget what you're doing to some extent, just think about tissue temperatures.
Okay.
And if it may well be something as simple as the amount of time your tissue temperatures are below 15 degrees Celsius, which is about 64 Fahrenheit, something like that for the US guys. And it may well be just an area under that curve. So you may go in for a swim, which is a matter of minutes. But if you then come out and you don't warm up properly, and then your tissues spend, the next hour below 15 degrees, that's part of the dose of cold that can contribute to a potential non-freezing cold injury. The other thing we know is that the threshold for that injury is reduced if you are doing things like dehydrated, if you're smoking, if you're standing still and stagnant, and your blood, so you're not perfusing the extremities, which is obviously the best way of rewarming them. So it's way too complicated, and there are way too many factors to say this or that. But we do know that, as I say, there is definitely a temperature duration combination in terms of that dose.
Got it.
Stephen, if I may, I found from my experience is that phenomena, which I had as well, and it's gone away luckily, tend to happen when we start swimming closer to zero, basically the sub-2 temperature, especially if you swim in Antarctica or Siberia, where the water temperature is basically at freezing level. That's when we tend to have these injuries. But what I want to ask Mike or Heather is that I also, when I first swam in Antarctica 2008, and I only swam for 18 minutes the first time, or 20 minutes, I can't remember. The water was 0 to 1. And my fingers actually were fine, but when I got home, it was summer, and suddenly I realized that my two toes don't feel each other when I touch my leg. So I realized that my toes were numb, and it took me about 3 months. And then when we swam in Murmansk Mile in 0 degrees, we all had a loss of sensation for a few months, and it slowly crept up. But it seems like it's gone away in the sense that I've swam in 0 and in 4, 3, 2 degrees since, and it hasn't come back. It tingles, but it hasn't come back, that numbness. It's almost as if I don't know, is it possible that extremities learn to deal with this? Obviously, not to the extreme, because I am aware that there's a limit to all of these things.
I'm happy to go first. I mean, the area you're talking about, everything I'm about to say is speculation, because we know very, very little. And it would be a fascinating project to look at the kind of tests that we will do regularly on, for example, military personnel who have been supposedly injured in Arctic warfare training. We have a whole range of tests which test both the neural and the microvascular responses. And that work has never been done with ice swimmers. But what I can tell you is, just from the symptomatology that you've described, is you're probably damaging nerves, and the time that this is taken is just the regrowth and the reestablishment of those sensory nerves, which classically takes that kind of time. Now, the fact that you're not seeing it now may well be that those sensory nerves are not as sensitive as they were, and there are a whole set of tests that you need to do to establish whether your baseline sensitivity is the same. That may have been diminished, which means you're not sensing it as much. Or, as you say, there may be some form of adaptation that we just don't know about. But you know, so as I say, it's speculative, but it doesn't surprise me that you're getting that response, and actually just your personal experience and the personal experiences of people listening to this will start to help us say, well, this is the kind of dose of cold exposure you need in order to produce what in your case is 2 or 3 months of essentially paresthesia and numbness and tingling and things like that. So I suspect there's a wealth of information out there that would help frame that. Now, of course, that's you. There may be another individual who does exactly the same thing as you and has less of a problem or more of a problem, because one thing that is absolutely, the only consistent thing in this is variability, which is ironic, but you know, the variability between people, because we all come with different experiences, we all come with different physiology, we all come with different comorbidities, whether that be, you know, dehydration, other peripheral vascular issues. So it's a fascinating area, and it's one which I think should be investigated, because when I look at the threats or hazards facing ice water swimmers, the one that leaps to mind every time are these peripheral vascular issues. I mean, I don't think hypothermia is going to be a problem if people do sensible things. Most people who do this are well acclimatized, or they know how to acclimatize. But the one thing that is inescapable is the potential damage to the peripheral vasculature through non-freezing cold injury.
So that's one of the reasons that when a lot of people ask me about ice bath and whether it's good for ice swimming or not, and I have my personal opinion and experience. Some people think that it helps or not, but I always say that if you are going to sit in ice bath, don't sit for too long. And if you decide to test your ability, just keep your hands up, because you don't need to train your fingers to suffer in order to swim in the ice, you know, because you're right. From my experience, sorry, a quick story, Stephen. I had an email from a guy from UK, asked me about these injuries, and I told him what you said. Look, it's a very personal thing, and unless you're a neurosurgeon or a pianist, you should be okay. And he came back and said, well, I'm actually a professional pianist in London. So I told him, I think you should stay away from ice swimming. You know, it's safer.
Heather, we've been talking about peripheral vascularity and some kind of nerve damage or vascular damage in our digits, perhaps in our toes, etc. Is there anything in the brain that, you know, all these things are happening, we have on our extremities, but, you know, the brain is, you know, our existence, that's our consciousness. Is there any damage, you know, short of being very hypothermic, that would happen on our brain if you're going to do an ice kilometer or ice mile?
That's a good question. And those studies haven't been done. Well, not to my knowledge anyway. Mike might be able to provide a different opinion. But yeah, I mean, we're now looking at, we've got much better technology to start to analyze what's actually going on in the brain. And so, yeah, there's the potential to start to investigate that sort of activity and see if there are any changes to brain activity as a result of swimming in very cold water.
Yeah. Mike?
I mean, just to follow up on what Heather has said, there's a couple of things. I mean, you know that when you go into cold water, you get a very significant increase in blood pressure. And the brain vasculature is designed to try and keep that blood pressure constant by changing. But I mean, there's a limit to how much you can do that. So there is the potential for cerebrovascular accident or, a rupturing of a vessel in the brain. However, again, if you're doing this sensibly and incrementally and habituating, we know that the blood pressure increase is diminished as you do that. But there's no doubt about it that, we all know if somebody doesn't prepare properly for even, a 10, 15 degree immersion, that they've got a chance of having it's not just drowning that's the problem. They've got also the chance of having a cerebrovascular or a vascular problem, a cardiac problem, a burst aneurysm. All of these things can happen because of what is a very significant challenge. The other thing that we're seeing more frequently as more people go into cold water, and around the UK, it's clearly not ice water. It's, we're down at about 8, we're up about 12 or 13 now, is we're seeing incidents of transient global amnesia. And this is people who sort of go swimming and then the next thing they say, I just don't remember anything about what I've just done. There's been a couple of cases just locally where I am in Cornwall in the last month or so. Again, we don't really know the mechanism of that, but clearly going into cold water and changing blood pressures and changing cerebral blood flows is having a potential impact in some areas. I'm always conscious about going onto these things and being the harbinger of doom. You're going to die from drowning, you're going to die from this, you're going to die. But the fact of the matter is, what ice swimming has, as with any cold water, has a potential list of risk factors. And the really smart thing to do, if you choose to do it, which is obviously your choice, is to mitigate those risks. And that's why you should do it with groups like this group, because they've got people who know what they're doing and are experienced and can tell you exactly how to go about doing it. What's bothering us a bit in the UK at the moment, there's an incredible upswing in the number of people doing open water cold swimming. And for us, that's, 8, 9, 10 degrees Celsius. But they're just going and doing it. And it's much safer to do it by registering with a club, registering with an organization, having a medical checkup, doing it supervised, So that's really the big push for us, is to try and make people not stop them doing it, but get them to do it in a sensible, safe and mitigated way.
Yeah, great. And Heather, this is, you opened up by saying was your initial area of expertise, really sharing how to do things responsibly, safely, gradually. If you had, 10 golden rules or 3 golden rules of people who are interested but not have yet done it, what would that be?
I think with any extreme sports, a lot of research needs to go into what activity you're actually getting yourself into. Find out about local organizations that can support you in gaining more knowledge about the environments that you're going to go into. If you have any concerns about your health, visit your doctor, your general practitioner, to advise them that this is something that you are considering doing and what impact that might have on your health. I think we do these things for fun, and that we shouldn't be impacting our health in a negative way because of something we think is potentially fun. So get yourself checked out to make sure that you're fit and healthy to participate in these activities. And then, as Mike said earlier, take it very gradually. You don't expect to be able to do an ice mile in your first attempt in cold water. Actually gradually build up. So if you've just started swimming in cold water, start in the summer, gradually increase the time and duration in the water in the summer water temperatures before then even considering going in winter swimming water temperatures, and just gradually build up from there, as opposed to go from no swimming in any form of cold water straight into an ice mile.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely wonderful, because, you know, I sit here, I'm in Southern California, I drive places. If I have to go to the second or third floor of a shopping center or a office building, I'm taking an elevator, I'm taking an escalator. If I go up to somewhere in the United States or the UK that's cold, I'm in a air-conditioned room or I'm in a heated room. And I think all these things, frankly, are making me weak, or weaker than, let's say, the human species were, you know, even 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. And I know, Mike, we were talking about this earlier, about how mankind have really changed the environment of which we exist. And how does that impact where we are now in the course of this discussion?
Yeah, so, I mean, other animals have had to adapt physiologically, anatomically, morphologically. So you see, you know, whales with blubber, and you see huskies with fur. Humans have done it intellectually. We've done it by recreating next to our skin, our equatorial origins, by clothing, by heating, air conditioning, building. And that's great when that works, of course, but we then are in trouble when it doesn't work, because we don't have any of the, you know, if we were left with just the amount we can shiver and the amount we can sweat to control our temperature, we would still be living in a pretty narrow band around this planet, around the equator. The other problem we've got is we've become so good at that we've become sort of thermostatic. And what I mean by that is we don't get the temperature swings and the challenges to our systems that we used to get, as you say, even just maybe 100 years ago, but certainly when we evolved. So we're still an animal that really needs to be exercising, exposed to heat, exposed to cold, and defending our sort of basic bodily systems. But we're not doing that. And I think that sort of all links into why people are taking on more challenges. I think something fairly innate is making people go out and run ultra marathons and climb mountains, more people than have ever done it before. And I also think it's one of the reasons why we're seeing in the clinical world things like heat exposures being good for people, cold exposures being good for people. And now these are now provided for people with type 2 diabetes. They're provided people with peripheral vascular issues. So, you know, we have systems in place to try and control all of these things, but they need to be perturbed. They need to be challenged. And the analogy that I used earlier was the one of the musculoskeletal system, which is a great system for moving you about and doing stuff. But if you stop moving about, it atrophies, it disappears. And then you can't do it. And you need to keep challenging that system to keep it functioning optimally. And I think that applies to all the regulatory systems of the body.
Got it.
Mike, if I may, I mean, sorry, I'm jumping back to recovery, but I do remember it is related to Stephen's question about the brain. I do remember in your talk in South Africa, you said something that was very fascinating to me. Because in ice swimming, we basically talk about the core body temperature as the golden sort of parameter to how we feel. And you mentioned at that talk that the brain temperature, if we could put if we could measure the brain temperature in recovery specifically, would be much more significant than the core body temperature. If you can maybe unpack it a little bit, because I found it very fascinating.
I think one, you've got a great memory, Ralph. I think it was probably over a decade ago, but it was in Cape Town. Yeah, I can't remember.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think probably the bit that stuck in your mind is I was talking about the measurement of rectal temperature, which is a classic way of measuring it. And I think I probably said something like, brain temperature is much more important. I don't know many people have died from a cold rectum, but I know quite a lot of people have died from a cold brain or a cold heart. And and that's probably the bit that's stuck. But it's certainly true that you know, one of the things that varies very significantly, there is no such thing as core body temperature or deep body temperature. There are temperatures that you can measure at the heart, you can measure at the brain, you can certainly get an estimation of core temperature from rectal temperature, from a temperature in the ear. But all of these measurements have shortcomings. And one of the problems with rectal temperature, and quite a lot of the data you see, for example, on what happens when you come out of very cold water, is based on rectal temperature. And we know that rectal temperature is a temperature that's primarily determined by conductive heat exchange rather than convective heat exchange, so blood flow. So if I take somebody out of cold water and I put them into hot water, which was the classic experiments that produced the term after drop, you will see an after drop in deep body temperature as measured in the rectum. You won't see an after drop if you measure the temperature of the heart. And that's because the rectum is essentially following what's happening to the body in terms of conduction, in terms of heat exchange. And what happens in the cold water, you set up a cold front going into the body that even if you take the body out and put it into hot water, that cold front has got to go through before the warm front follows it. However, when you take a body from cold water and put it in hot water, it very quickly starts to pick up some blood flow in the skin, and that blood flow gets straight back to the heart and warms the heart. And this was Frank Golden's PhD work, and he measured temperature in the brain, in the esophagus, in the rectum, and showed a very good after drop in the rectum. No after drop whatsoever at the level of the heart when you take somebody from cold water and put them into hot. And that's why I'm always, I know it sounds a bit pernickety, but I'm always very careful about making a distinction between the after drop, which was originally defined as what happens when you take somebody from cold water and put them into hot water, as opposed to what happens when you take somebody from cold water and they wander about, you know, which is just continued cooling. Or they, you know, so we have to be a little bit careful because the after drop is very specifically that. But if I come out and I start walking about, then I'll get a continued fall in deep body temperature because I'm now starting to perfuse muscles that haven't been perfused, and that will give me a convective cooling. So we know that you'll get 2 or 3 times a greater fall in deep body temperature when you leave cold water if you exercise in those initial minutes. So I think that's probably what you're referring to. And the point is that, you know, that the important organs of the body to protect from hypothermia are the heart and the brain. And that's where you really want to be measuring the temperature. Unfortunately, we can't do it.
So what I mean, I saw a talk of both of you when you compared us, I swimmer in recovery to a watermelon. Sorry, it was a sweet melon.
Yeah, get it right.
No, it's much better than the previous analogy. And what for non-scientific ice swimmer that, you know, when we finish an ice swim, have they know what I'm talking about, and I'm sure you do a little bit as well. We go through a very unpleasant sort of recovery. And I'm talking about prolonged swims for at least 1 kilometer. The after drop after 3 or 4 minutes is just like a stronger shiver. I'm talking about 1 kilometer, or let's say 17, 20 minutes to 30 minutes. What actually happened to us? And assuming that we don't go wander around and lost, we are being dried and rewarmed in a procedure. What actually happened to us?
I mean, probably the easiest way to explain that is with a figure, which I can show you. Does that work? If we cut to if I share my, can I share my screen?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I can. Okay. Okay, let's start with this one. So I'll just show you a couple of slides, which hopefully will. There we go. Can you see that?
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. So it doesn't really matter what the water temperature is, but here it's 12 degrees. And here we're seeing the deep body temperature of the people during that swim, and it's cooling. And the point that we make is that if you at this point take them from cold water and you put them into warm water, remember this is rectal temperature now, you'll see a continued fall in deep body temperature that is exactly the same rate as that established whilst you were swimming. And that helps us determine that this is a conductive phenomenon. So you've got this cold front that is now moving into the body, and it continues to move into the body until such times as the warmth that you're getting from the water reverses that gradient. And I think if I go on a couple of this, there we are. I've even one I prepared earlier for you, Ram. So I mean, classically, what happens is you're in warm air, you go into cold water, and those of you who have measured your deep body temperature with a pill, for example, will note that nothing happens for about 5 or 10 minutes. But that the length of time that nothing happens is very much dependent on how big you are. The bigger you are, the fatter you are, the longer it takes that cold front to move through your skin, through your superficial tissues, your subcutaneous fat, your muscle, and get to the core. And so the length of that period of no temperature change when you've gone into the cold is pretty well correlated to the thickness of your outer tissues. You then start to cool down here, and then you come out of the water here, and that continues until such time as whatever you're doing to warm yourself starts to have an effect, and then you start to warm up. And that's the bit that's classically been called the afterdrop. And one of the reasons you can prove that this is nothing to do with blood flow is if you take yourself a melon and you put a thermometer in the middle of it, so you're measuring the middle of it, but it's a whole melon, and you block the hole that the thermometer is in, you put that melon, you warm it to 37, and then you do this experiment, you'll see exactly the same profile as you see in a human. You take the melon out of the water there, the center of that melon will continue to cool, even though you've now got the melon in hot water, until such time as that hot front moves into the core. And the length of time it takes for this to change is related to the length of time it took for that to change. And that's when you're looking. So effectively, the center of that melon is rectal temperature. And if you want to have another model of it, here's the core temperature at 35, the water temperature at 5, it could be 0, and you've got this gradient. If you now put the water at 40, you start to reverse that gradient. The skin gets warm, then slowly the fat. But in the middle, it's still losing heat to the intermediate tissues. Now, what we also know is if you take somebody and put them in hot water and you measure heart temperature, you don't see such a large afterdrop. But if you come out of the water and you don't go into hot water, you just dry yourself, warm yourself, you will see a continued fall in deep body temperature. You will be at your coldest maybe 10, 15 minutes after you've come out of the water. And what bothers us with some situations, and Heather, and we're doing some research in this area, is often people come out of a swim, they have 10 or 15 minutes, and then they jump in their car and they drive away. And they're driving away at the time where they're actually at their most debilitated by cold. So I think that one of the things that we need to see change is we need to see people taking more responsibility post-swim for getting people back to normal before they go off and try and do skills like driving.
Got it. Wow.
Fascinating. Yeah.
Ram, what swim did you do that you had the most difficulty in recovery? And would you have done anything differently? And then explain that. I'd like Mike and Heather to comment on that particular experience. What could you have done differently?
Differently, I would have swum shorter, probably. I don't think I could have avoided. I think my first swim in Antarctica, I had no idea what to expect. You know, it's one of these things that I never heard about afterdrop, or I knew that I shivered, but I never expected. Yeah, it was quite a nasty thing because I had no idea what was coming, you know. Like Mike said, and I've learned the first 5 minutes, usually I've got 5 minutes after the swim before I get hit by the afterdrop. So I try and do everything quickly in the first 5 minutes because I still fine. I dry myself, I get dressed, and I get myself to a place where I'm comfortable sitting, and then I'm waiting for this to hit me. The hardest one was probably when I did Lake Zurich swim, but then I swam 45 minutes in 4 degrees. And I pushed myself to finish that swim. It was basically the first ice mile. It was just before I founded ISA. And I just pushed myself to finish the swim. I had divers and I had 4 boats and I had medical support. So I kind of trusted them. But I couldn't really talk when I finished, which never happened to me before. And they took me, they put me in a car and they took me straight to a sports center and kind of rolled me into the kiddies pool, which was at about 35 degrees. And I basically nearly passed out. I just told them, take me out immediately of that pool because and they took me out, which slowed down my recovery. And then we went to a shower. And I stood in a shower with sort of lukewarm water. So I've learned a lot from that is try and control your recovery in the sense that stay focused. Some people just let go. I stay focused. I try. Some doctor might not agree with me. I don't like to lie down. Because when I lie down and I close, and people, when they lie down, they tend to close their eyes and then I start spacing out. So I'd like to sit down and I'd like to maintain eye contact with someone near me that keeps me from almost disappearing. I don't like to rush. I've learned not to rush recovery. Doesn't matter how cold you are, you can't go into 90 degrees sauna or jump into 45 degrees hot bath. And it's a slow process. So very, very interesting. I'm still very interested in what Mike said about the correlation between how long it took you to start feeling the cold inside, deep inside, to the rate of recovery. So I usually say, just be prepared because it's coming. Doesn't matter how experienced you are. If you're going to be in the water sub 5 for 30 minutes plus, you are going to go through 10 minutes to an hour of a very uncomfortable process of recovery. So what I do now, and the advice I give people now, is plan for this. Don't just go swim, come out and think that just because you got a warm jacket and a warm thing, you will recover. I plan my recovery. I know where my clothes are. I even tell someone, look, when I come out, I want to get dry. I want to get dressed. I want you to find a warm place and sit me down. And then, and don't rush me too much. Don't push me too much. Don't rub my skin too hard. Just be there. And that's it. And I know I have to ride it. It's not something that I just have to wait that period that Mike said, whatever it is for me, to come out of this. There's no shortcuts. And so for me, I always tell people, don't over panic. Don't get too, because if people get anxious, it's not really the right time to panic or get anxious. Just know that it might take you 5 minutes to 15 minutes. You're going to come out of this. I've seen it hundreds of times. So being relaxed, I think, is very important. Don't panic. You're not going to die. Or very, very, very unlikely you're going to die. Just relax and wait for it. You'll warm up. It's for my experience. Yeah.
Before Mike and Heather answer, I just want to summarize. I just looked it up. That was in January 2009, and you swam for 1.3 miles. That was in Lake Zurich, in 4-degree water, and it took you 43 minutes. Now, I do remember, I seem to recall, Ram, they pulled you out and they put you on the boat. Was that correct?
No. That was Andrew. Sorry.
Oh, that was Andrew. Okay.
Andrew never swum before.
Uh-huh.
And what happened the night before, I wanted to swim 3 kilometers because I swam 1 kilometer in 1 degree or under 1. So I thought, it's 4 degrees. I'm going to swim 3 to 4 kilometers, just nearly linear extrapolation, which was completely wrong. And then we walked a course the night before, and I said, shit, this is really long. Okay, sorry. My dog's...
As he's getting his dogs, do you want to comment on his...
My dogs are getting supper, so they're getting all excited. Andrew decided he wants to do a kilometer, and I think after 1.1 or 1.2 kilometers, he said, I've been there before, and I knew that after 1 kilometer, I was fine. I was going to swim at least 2 kilometers. I'm very glad I didn't put 3 kilometers because I wouldn't have finished it probably. I would have finished it in a... You need to be fast to swim. It's time in the water at the end of the day. I'm too skinny to spend more than an hour in this water temperature. I don't have enough extra outer skin that Mike referred to. I need another 20 kg.
Fat is the word you're looking for. It's the same insulative quality as cork. Fat and cork are about the same in terms of insulation. So, it's that's what you're talking about. Yeah. Whilst Heather's collecting, there's a few things that come out of that which I think are important to just mention. Number one is, and I'll be interested in, because Heather's done more of this than I have, but I mean, the message number one is this is a very individual thing, and we can talk about this, but what people need to find out is what works for them. And I would also argue that they need to put as much time and effort into planning their recovery as they do their swim, because actually that's the time when you're at your coldest. That's the time when it's not a good time to be making novel decisions because you're in the worst state to do it. So plan that recovery, plan what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, how you're going to be rewarmed, have no time pressure, quite right. This is a slow physical phenomenon. It's not a neural phenomenon. It's not going to happen instantaneously. Everything you said is correct. The other point to make is that there is a person, we talked about the brain earlier, there is a personality difference. And one of the things that we see with elite athletes, elite forces, and elite explorers is they all have the ability to push themselves way beyond where the average person would push themselves. And that's compounded when you are used to cold water because you become habituated to it. So you don't get the same sensory cues. You have to be habituated to do it, but also you don't get the same level of discomfort where somebody will say, oh, I'm not doing that. The body is naturally averse to getting too hot or too cold. But of course, you're going to sidestep that through habituation. So the other thing you've got to be very careful about is, making sure that you don't overextend yourself and not making decisions about what you're going to do by how you feel at the time, because the way you feel will have no reflection whatsoever, in terms of your physiological state. Several years ago, I spoke to Phil Rush, and you'll know Phil Rush is one of only 2 people to have done the Channel 3 ways non-stop. He now takes people across the Cook Strait in New Zealand, which is a pretty rough crossing to undertake. And he fairly regularly has people swim to unconsciousness. These people are highly motivated. They want to do it. They've paid to do it, and they swim. And I didn't even think this was possible, but actually it is possible because you can become unconscious at around about 33 degrees Celsius, 30 degrees Celsius deep body temperature. Your muscles will keep functioning until 27. So if you're determined enough, you can swim to the point of unconsciousness. So never ever make a decision about your swim or about your rewarming that hasn't been planned. Don't try and make a clever decision off the cuff because it'll almost inevitably be a bad decision. I think that anything to add to that, Heather?
I nearly did the classic thing there of trying to speak while muted. Yeah, so, yeah, I agree with Mike there entirely. And I think it's really important that it's not only the swimmer that's undertaking this process of organising what their recovery will involve, but actually involve the rest of the team. And that team should involve a qualified, experienced medic who has relevant experience of emergency medicine in order to undertake these types of challenges. Now, they can be undertaken in quite remote locations, and so it might be a challenge there getting people to hospital. And so it's actually really important that risk assessment is planned in advance, and also that plan and risk assessment is looked at independently as well, just to check that it's not just a piece of paper, that actually there has been some careful thought and planning about that. But also, going into cold water is not just a thermal physiological challenge, but we also see changes in blood biochemistry that occur when we're swimming in cold water. And as a consequence of being in cold water, swimmers can develop something called a metabolic acidosis, primarily because they're working at quite high intensities in terms of the exercise that they're undertaking.
What was that? What is that you said?
It's a metabolic acidosis. So that occurs by, because you're exercising at quite a high intensity, that basically means that there's a large amount of blood lactate being produced that isn't being removed quickly enough from the blood. And quite frequently that can result in, that can be resolved by the body. But what it does is it compensates for that by overbreathing or hyperventilation. So swimmers might experience either in the water or during their exit or even in recovery, they may start to hyperventilate towards the end of their swim. So if a swimmer is going to do that, then there's a potential while they're in the water to aspirate or take in water, or breathe in water. So we need to make sure the team are aware of this. It may also be problematic on exit from the water. If they're already feeling dizzy or nauseous because of this process occurring, then actually by exiting the water, reimposing gravity by standing up, that's going to make that dizziness, exacerbate that dizziness. And also, if that's occurring in the recovery period, people need to know that they may start to hyperventilate in that situation as well, and that it is a process that can occur. So it's really important that your medic and your team understand the physiology of what's going on to the swimmer at all points during that swim.
Wow.
Mike, sorry, Stephen.
No. I'm thoroughly impressed.
Okay. It is very, very interesting. I want to ask you, Mike, because you said, well, Heather as well, of course, but you said you've done some work with Army, and you know, I've spent 5 years in the Army, Israeli Army, and we learn to sleep while we walk because, and occasionally, it was quite funny at the time where suddenly one of the soldiers just walk at night and suddenly just fall into the ditch because he just fell asleep and at some stage lost their balance because we didn't have much time to sleep. So you have to learn to sleep while you walk. But, and it relates to what you said about Philip and unconsciousness, because we do have, like any other sport in ice swimming, we do have some swimmers that will swim until they possibly pass out or get close to that. They sink rather than pass. What do you think, from your experience with research in the Army, we should look for when someone pushes beyond the physical limit in ice swimming? What signs do you think we could look for to try and prevent someone from falling asleep while they swim?
Yeah, so we've published papers on, in fact, that very first experiment that I told you about that I did, Frank Golden's work on swim failure in cold water, and subsequently published in Essentials of Sea Survival, a book, a very clear set of diagrams that show you the progression from normal swimming through to essentially completely incapacitated swimming. And as I say, it is possible to swim to unconsciousness, but it's not the norm. The norm is for people to suffer from peripheral cooling in the limbs, which causes neurophysiological and incapacitation, so neuromuscular incapacitation. And you'll see the classic signs of that are the body goes from being horizontal in the water to slightly more upright. The swim stroke length decreases, the swim frequency increases until they become more upright and more upright. And so the telltale signs of early swim failure, which anybody, as Heather says, who is supporting somebody should be absolutely acutely aware of, is that move, that shortening of stroke length, that increase in stroke frequency, that shift to a more upright posture, which increases the sinking force, increases the drag, they become much more inefficient. And then if you allow that continue, they end up essentially doing a sort of grabbing, ladder climbing activity just to stay afloat. They'll go under, come up, go under, come up, then go under. And it's very, very clearly described. And it's one of the things that you should keep an eye on. The other thing that it's worth doing is just, you can either do it in advance, but you can periodically just check the level of consciousness of someone. So you can ask them to shout a number back at you that you shout at them. You say 24, they shout 24 back. You know, just to make sure that they're not managing to keep swimming, but actually their brain is becoming cold enough for them to start slipping towards unconsciousness. Apart from that, I mean, obviously monitoring deep body temperature and doing it in a more technological way is feasible, but the easy ways are looking for the telltale signs of physical incapacitation and diminished consciousness. Now, I just picked that point up because the really important point that Heather made is about being really picky about the medical support that you get. Because unfortunately, quite a lot of organizations just think as long as they've got a doctor or a paramedic, they're fine. But this is specialist stuff. You know, we've talked about stuff that I guarantee your average medic will not know a thing about. So make sure that you either get a medic who specializes in cold water, open water swimming, hypothermia, drowning, that sort of thing, or supplement your medic with someone like you, Ram, who knows what they're talking about in this area. Because I do worry that sometimes there's a sort of, you know, oh, we've got a doctor, that's okay. But the doctor maybe have no specific or relevant experience. And this is a very, very, you know, sub-speciality in terms of what a medic would know about.
What I mean, that you've just given me idea that maybe we start, because we are educating people in ice swimming to be to observe the rules. And ice swimming is integrity and safety of the sport. And we don't really, because I'm not a medical professional, we don't have any education program, Stephen, or anything like that to teach medical professionals, because it is a very unknown area. And again, it reminds me when we went, South African, we went to swim in Antarctica, and there were two doctors on the boat, one passenger doctor and one expedition doctor. And we realized very quickly in the briefing that the doctor, he would know what to do. He's a GP and he knows what to do with people on the boat, but he doesn't have any idea what to do with us. And we looked after each other and we were experienced, and it wasn't our first ice smile. But after we finished the expedition, he rewrote the medical, whatever you call it, book of the boat, because he suddenly realized that he knows nothing about what happens if the boat gets into trouble and people will have to start taking into the water. He completely underestimated. So you've given me actually two good ideas, because the numbers, because sometimes people want to swim an ice mile and we don't know if they can swim an ice mile. So one of the things that I do, I say, okay, after the 1 kilometer, we're going to have some sort of signals to see if you're okay to continue, because people, so they can do at least 1 kilometer, continue to a mile. But I'm actually going to introduce something new, that when they finish a kilometer, all they have to do, and I'll tell them before, is to look at me and say 1 kilometer. And every time they get to the next buoy, 1.2, they just have to tell me 1.2, 1.4. So I don't have to do anything. I just, in the briefing, I'll tell them, if you don't tell me when you get to the 1.2 buoy, 1.4 buoy, whatever the buoys are, the number, I'll pull you out. And very interesting. Anyway, you gave me some interesting idea. Thank you.
Good. Well, anything that makes it safer and makes it a more enjoyable experience, therefore, is worth trying to do. Yeah, absolutely. Good.
Yeah. And before we end up, if both of you could actually, if you have a website or some place where people can learn more of your career and your research, and perhaps how to collaborate with you. I mean, you're at the University of Portsmouth. It seems that you've got all this knowledge in the institution amongst yourselves, and how do people learn about all the research you're doing, all the thoughts that you're doing, all the ideas that you have? It would be great to share that with us. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Well, as the mic turns on, so I can show you what I'd like to do, Stephen, is just show you 2 slides. One is my final slide, which has all that contact detail on, so that you can just put that up if you want, rather than people having to listen to me even more. And the other is I've got one figure that you might want to just put in at some stage, which is the signs and symptoms of non-freezing cold injury. It's up to you whether you do it or not. Yeah. And what I'll do is also, outside of this meeting, I'll send you a link to the paper that we did that shows you how to recognize imminent swim failure.
Great.
And then you add that to your it may be of use, and people can have that. So just bear with me whilst I do that share screen thing again. So there we are. I mean, you only need to take a snapshot of it, but there's the short-term symptoms of non-freezing cold injury, which I'm pretty sure everybody has experienced to some extent. And there's the longer term ones we talked about: cold sensitivity, increased sweating in the injured area, and then it becomes pain, intractable pain, bone and joint damage, gait changes. And it's all, and we remember talking about your hands getting better, Ram. Well, there we are. Large nerves regrow about 1 millimeter per day. So you can start to get a feel for how long the things are going to take to get ready, to get better. And that's one thing. And then there we are. So if you want to get in contact with me, I pretty much publicize everything we do on Twitter there. And this link here is to all our research papers, and people can download for free all the reviews we've done. And then, of course, there's the book that I did with my dear friend Frank Golden, The Essentials of Sea Survival, and a more recent one on beach lifeguarding, which includes some interesting science. If you go onto the University of Portsmouth web pages and the Extreme Environments Laboratory web page, there'll be even more. And if people want to send me an email, it's there.
Great. Thank you very much. Heather, do you have information you can share?
You're muted, Heather.
I'm mute.
I'm terrible. Okay, I'm just adding that there. Oh. Okay. Screen. That's not working. Why's that not working? Okay, sorry about this.
No problem.
Yeah, okay, so my details are here. Best way of getting in touch with me is via this link here. I do have a Twitter account, but I'm not as good as Mike in terms of monitoring it. So the best way of getting in touch with me is by this email address here. heather.massey@port.ac.uk.
Great. Can you leave this photo up here? Where is this body of water? What is this?
This is Westwater in the Lake District, which is in the northwest of England. It's the let me get this right. It's the coldest lake in the Lake District, and it's a beautiful place. It's very close to Scafell Pike, which is one of the tallest. The tallest mountain. It's more of a hill, to be honest, in England. And from there, you can see from the top of Scafell Pike, you can see the sea. It's very close to the sea. So this is at the foothills of one of the peaks of the Lake District in England.
Got it.
And Westwater is the deepest, Heather.
It is the deepest, is it? Okay. It's also the coldest as well.
Yeah. And if you want to do a triathlon, don't go to the Lake District because it's horribly hard.
Yeah.
Well, it's cold water. It's very steep hills, and it's very steep running. I did it once. I'm not doing it again.
Got it.
Surprisingly enough, the lakes are fairly flat, Mike.
Oh yes, yeah. You don't do much uphill swimming. That's true.
No, that's true.
Yeah. Well, this is my last question, and this is a question that often comes up. And I don't know the best way to answer it. I'm hopeful that you two do. I have 5 degrees, let's say in a Lido. I have 5 degrees in a lake, and I have 5 degrees in the ocean. All those 5-degree waters feel differently to me. Why?
Well, partly it's because in the ocean you'll be more buoyant, because there's salt in the ocean, and there's chlorine probably in the Lido. So it'll partly be to do with the other things that are in the water, and also even things like the depth of your immersion, depending on what you're wearing and the levels of buoyancy. And I think also there's a psychological component. It's I think we underestimate the psychophysiology of doing these kind of things. I've had several examples where people can get learned helplessness or hopelessness. And this is the person that's in the water and they see the rescue helicopter pass over the top of them and not stop. And they then feel they've been missed. Or the person who goes into the water wearing a dry suit, and all dry suits leak, but they don't know that because they've never been told. And there's leaks and they think they're the ones that's got the leaky dry suit. They're the one that's going to die. And the impact of that on somebody's psychology is incredible. And it works the other way around. We know that quite a few people at the point of being rescued, they collapse before they've been touched. And we think it's to do with the relief of an imminent rescue. And it's made worse if you say to that person, rest, relax, you're safe, we've got you. Actually, it increases the likelihood of them having a problem. What you're supposed to say, what we recommend you say instead is, stay positive, keep fighting for your survival. We're here to help, but you've got to work. So, I think it's a little bit of all of those things. It's the other things that are in the water, and there's a psychophysiological component. But I could be completely wrong.
Stephen, I was given an answer to that question before, but again, it wasn't by a scientific person. So we speculated. And what we speculated is that because of the salinity of the water, which, like Mike said, can be impacted by salt or chlorine or the thousands of people who swam there the day before, it affects the conductivity of the water. And therefore, theoretically, in fresh water with whatever pH 7, zero salinity, or basically the lowest salinity level, the heat conduct much faster, or cold conduct. That's what I've been told. It made a little bit of sense, but I'm not scientific enough to understand that. Sorry.
Yeah, well, that's going to change the density of the water, which is going to change things like heat loss. But the other thing to remember, of course, is the amount of water movement that's going on. If you're in a river, there's quite a lot of movement going on, which is going to increase convective cooling. If If you're in a lido, that's probably still. The sea has got movement, but of a different type. And all of these things are going to, because what you're actually sensing is not water temperature, you're sensing skin temperature. And that can be impacted by all of the things we've talked about.
Got it. Heather, do you have anything to add on that point, or conjectures?
No, I think there is definitely a psychological component to feeling the difference in different water temperatures, or even the same water temperature in different locations or different environments. I mean, we only have to sort of swim on 2 separate days, one where we have the sun out, and it's a lovely sunny day, and one where it's cloudy, but the air temperatures are exactly the same. We might have a different radiant load, but the air temperature may be exactly the same, and it can transform the swim.
True, true. Well, thank you very much for this time. It's very valuable, very educational, and Ram, as usual, very inspirational. Thank you.
Thank you. It was very interesting, Mike and Heather.
Pleasure. And Ram, I hope it's sooner than 10 years that our paths cross again. Yeah, we'll see.
I remember that.
Yeah, it's nice to meet you, and it's nice to meet you, Steve, as well. I'll send you some stuff by email, but thanks very much for the opportunity to chat. It's been great fun, and thanks, Heather.
Please see me as well. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.